It's actually a pleasure to introduce Professor Edward Jones-Imhotep today, who's an associate professor at the STS program at York University. He got his PhD from Harvard, the History of Science program, and he's a cultural historian of technology who has published in a number of international journals, including our own HSNS. And I think we caught it in the middle of two different projects. And I'm not entirely sure where this talk is fitting in. He's going to tell us. The previous project that I know about was a project about nation building and socio-technical systems. It was about Canada, the identity of Canada, the reshaping of Canadian identity in the Cold War period, the first couple of decades after the war. Which Edward is telling us as a story that has to do with new infrastructures, particularly communication infrastructures, and the understanding and control of nature, especially the northern part of Canada, which of course became an incredibly important strategic region, and therefore the point is that one cannot really understand the reconstruction of Canadian identity if you don't look at these processes of exploration, control, infrastructure buildings, and so on. The new project has to do with the emergence of a very interesting concept, which is that of technological reliability, and is, as far as I understand, a long durée project that goes back to the end of the 18th century up to the end of the 20th century. And the idea there is that of looking at an age of machines which requires something that is often overlooked, which is a trust in machines. Right? If machines become incredibly pervasive in our everyday social life, you need to have a widespread and fairly well-distributed trust in these machines. So the way in which Edward is looking at this is by, in a way, writing a genealogy of the emergence of a technological self, which is in a way is a site where questions of the trustworthiness of machines intersect questions about the trustworthiness of people. Now, as you can tell, just from these very brief remarks, I mean, Edward's breadth of interests and expertise is very broad, and I'm very impressed by whenever I talk to him. And I think today we're going to have another example of this breadth and the way in which he's able to bring together ideas and questions from different fields and make them interact in fruitful ways with this talk, of which I don't really know very much about, but here we are. Please join me in welcoming Professor Edward Jones-Imhotep. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Massimo, for that very kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation to all of you for coming to the talk as well, to Annie for helping to set up all the logistics. Yeah, I'll maybe make some very brief comments about where this project fits into kind of my larger interests. So the current project that I'm working on is a kind of book-length project called Reliable Humans, Trustworthy Machines. And the idea behind that book project is relatively simple, but it ends up leading to very kind of complex answers and questions that arise from it. And the idea behind it mainly is that if you ask yourself why make machines reliable, today that seems like a relatively self-evident, there are self-evident answers to that question. But it turns out that there are certain historical periods in which asking the question, why make machines reliable, is the same as asking the question, what kinds of people should we be? And so this book-length project explores that dimension of how it is that the emergence of reliability of machines, of technological reliability, is bound up with a history of the technological self. So the talk that I want to give today is kind of prolifically, kind of orthogonally related to those kinds of interests in the sense that it deals with the technological self. But it's meant to solve a kind of a different question. I came to Glenn Gould, who I'll tell you much more about over the course of the talk, but I came to Glenn Gould not through music, which is the way that most people come to Glenn Gould, but through actually philosophy and history of technology. And one of the things that I realized in reading people who had written about Gould is that the literatures that we would feel kind of most affinity to, so writers, for instance, like Giorgio Agamben or Edward Said or Richard Sennett, who write about Gould, almost always dismiss Gould's interests in materials, in material objects and technologies. They treat, for instance, his philosophy of technology as if it's kind of an interesting sidebar to his real interest, which is a kind of idealism about music. And so in looking into Gould and in thinking about this question about the technological self in parallel, I realized that there is a way in which we can actually take Gould's philosophy of technology seriously, and it ends up being very fruitful. But the way to do that is to see Gould's interest in technology not only as an interest about music, but as an interest in morality, and specifically in how certain people can be redeemed through technology, through the occasion of music. So music isn't in some ways the subject of Gould's interest in technology, it's the occasion for the subject, which is a kind of morality. And so that's what I want to talk to you about then today, malleability of machines, Glenn Gould, and the technological self. So Glenn Gould was after the most immaterial of things, abstract musical structures and ideal lines that could only be glimpsed darkly in the markings of sheet music or compositional sketches, the kinds of things that sound itself might reveal but could never contain. The virtuoso classical pianist of his age, he abandoned concerts forever at the age of 32, pushing aside the defining objects of his life and work, the recital hall, the live performance, at times even the piano, for the isolation and potential of the recording studio, its machines, and its media. Gould's abandoning of the concert hall forms the bright line dividing his life, like Nietzsche's walk with Lou Salome in the Gardens of Orta, or the 1964 Hajj of Malcolm X. Against the clarity of that rupture stands the inscrutability of motivations. Why did Gould really embrace recording technologies? Did he genuinely view them as the new hinge on which the musical world turned? Or were his sweeping statements about technology, elaborated most systematically in The Prospects of Recording, a famous publication of his, just a ruse, an elaborate philosophical superstructure hiding baser motives, his hatred of traveling, his love of isolation, his hypochondria, his reclusiveness? Worse still, have they functioned as a mundane distraction, obscuring the central aspect of Gould's thinking, an idealism in which musical instruments, electronic devices, and even sound mattered considerably less than the idea of the music itself? Gould himself inspired and reinforced those perceptions. He hailed the womb-like security of the studio as a refuge. He sanctioned the recording process only to the extent that it could make itself, make all the ingenious technical feats that play a part of it, invisible. But invisibility is not irrelevance. Gould worked and wrote and thought about recording from within massive transformations in the material culture of music, its social organization, its economic model, its creation, and its sounds. Those transformations have often gone under the title of the technologization of music, and Gould's attention to them as brute, powerful historical facts suggests another interpretation. So in pursuing his ethereal goals, Gould circled obsessively around material objects. He agonized over the smoothness and action of piano keys, the qualities of a chair, the pliability of the body, the placement of splices in magnetic tape. He saw in microphones and reel-to-reel tape recorders the possibility of intimacy, precision, and even redemption. He located his concerns among the emerging technologies of the 1960s, the avant-garde film and literary techniques that inspired him, the concert hall he despised, and the jazz and chance music that he tolerated. This paper argues that for Gould, the properties of machines and media were crucial not just as a set of implements for pursuing disembodied aesthetic aims, but as the material instruments of a moral project. For Gould, the great sin of the concert hall was that it had created certain kinds of people and encouraged them to abdicate what Gould saw as their responsibilities for individual judgment. Only the specific qualities of recording technologies could redeem them. Like the scrolls of the ancient Socratics or the lab notebooks and grid drawings of 19th century scientific atlas makers, machines and magnetic tape were the instruments through which to fashion new kinds of people. Gould placed them at the center of a theory about technology and history, and used them to elaborate a commitment to a certain kind of technologized music, one that tied morality and aesthetics, intimacy and isolation to a concrete ideal for the kinds of people we ought to be. That story gets very complicated very quickly, so it's perhaps best to start simply. It begins with a metaphor. So Gould had deep aesthetic objections to the concert hall, and those aesthetic objections were rooted in the idea of musical structure. So what Gould sometimes called the line or the architecture of a piece of music. So the music that most interested Gould involved counterpoint, where you have a number of independent voices with independent melodies that come together to form an interdependent harmony. So if you imagine, for instance, playing the piano, that the right and left hands could actually play independent melodies, but they come together to form something that we can understand as a kind of harmony. So visually, that looks something like this. This is actually one of the Goldberg variations from Bach, and you can see in the first kind of 2 lines of notes, the notes for the right and left hands. And the point is that they're not identical to one another, and yet if you were to play them, they kind of reinforce one another as well. So it looks like this, it sounds something like this. So that's actually Gould playing one of the Goldberg variations, and you can hear them, the 2 hands basically playing the kind of independent melodies. But the idea is that Gould in that case is interested in the kind of minute structure, that what he calls kind of the fine structure, this kind of minute interconnections between the different notes to construct this kind of larger structure or the harmony. And the point is that he believes then that the goal of the responsibility really of the artist is to come up with an interpretation of the structure, this larger structure, is to divine that structure through a kind of analysis and then relay it through a public through the playing of it. So Gould is absolutely relentless in his pursuit then of this question of structure. And he constantly, even obsessively, bends the material objects around him towards those ends. So there's the famous chair, for instance, that Gould ended up playing on. It's adapted by his father from a set of folding chairs, actually, for a card table. The individual legs are actually tapped with screws that you can see here so that they can be individually adjusted for height, so that Gould can rock back and forth as he likes to do when he actually plays the piano. Toward the end of Gould's life, it's held together, as you can see here, again, by wire, by electrical tape around the joints, by metal brackets as well, because it's practically falling apart. In certain of his later recordings, you can actually hear it creaking as he's kind of rocking back and forth playing the piano as well. There's also the piano itself, which is raised up on wooden blocks. Its keys the action of its keys are shortened to 1/16 of an inch. The keys themselves are scoured with abrasives because Gould doesn't like the kind of smoothness of their feel. The hammers themselves are later fitted with blunted metal spikes so that it sounds more like a clavichord than it does like a piano. But even the body ends up being the object of this kind of obsession as well. So Gould had a very peculiar style for playing the piano, which you can see here a little bit. He liked to sit quite low to the piano, often hunched over with his legs crossed, which drove many people crazy. And the effort for playing then ended up coming mainly from the lower back rather than the upper arms, which is how most people end up playing the piano. And so he would, when he injured himself, actually conduct these kind of minute experiments on his body as well and take these very detailed notes about the results. He assembled this array of color-coded bottles and pills for various conditions that he believed that he suffered from. So anxiety or sleep disorder, for instance, or general unease, Valium, dietary supplements, sleeping pills, and so on. He soaked his hands, for instance, in warm water for 20 minutes before every performance. He performed electroshock on his arms in order to kind of loosen the muscles. And it reminds us then that for Gould, this pursuit of structure was also prosecuted then here in the small of the back and in the ache of the wrist. But for Gould then, nothing stood, no material object stood in the way of structure as much as the concert hall itself. There was nothing that compared to it for Gould in terms of its size, in terms of its scale, in terms of its obstinacy. So this is a picture of Gould performing in Massey Hall in Toronto. It's a terrible picture, but in this case, actually, that's exactly the point, because it turns out that the photographic problem that's portrayed here is a direct analog of the acoustic and aesthetic problem that Gould ended up pointing to as well. And essentially, there are 2 issues to that problem, the aesthetic difficulties that Gould found with the concert hall. One is what you might call a problem of perspective. So with any concert hall, the audience has to be arranged, individual audience members have to be arranged at varying distances in various directions, obviously, from the stage. And because of this, then, no 2 experiences of a musical performance are identical, Gould argues. And so this is somebody, for instance, who's sitting at the back of the back left of the second balcony where this picture is taken from, has a different experience of a musical piece than somebody sitting, for instance, front row center. And so the idea then is that is amplified, it's more pronounced pronounced when you end up having orchestra performances, obviously, where you have, for instance, strings on the left and percussion or piano on the right. But Gould believed that that was true also of simple piano performances. And because of that, the structure of a piece was a kind of fractured experience. No two people had exactly the same experience of the structure that was trying to be portrayed by the performer. The second problem, though, that Gould pointed to was a problem of what we might call detail rather than perspective. The difficulty with the concert hall for Gould is that whatever its original motivations, it had gradually developed to emphasize what Gould called acoustic splendor. So this kind of resonant, luscious, kind of sensuous sound that a number of the traditional concert halls ended up displaying was something that Gould actually distrusted very deeply. He saw this as the irrational part of music. It was something, for instance, that was dependent on the material qualities of the concert hall itself. It was something that depended on the properties of sound after it left the instrument. And so it was something that a composer, for instance, couldn't specify in a score, and it's something that the performer themselves couldn't actually control. And because of that, Gould was very suspicious of it, and he believed that it ended up obscuring, this kind of sensuous sound often ended up obscuring the fine structure that he was actually interested in. And so to compensate for that, to compensate for the sound of these concert halls, performers often ended up changing, for instance, the tempo at which they played. So they would play slower in order to separate the notes more to get more clarity. But that would further distort the structure then for Gould. And so Gould basically believed that this notion of this kind of resonant sound was something that impeded the proper communication of structure. So there were concert halls that avoided that. So if you read Emily Thompson's very beautiful work on early 20th century America and the kind of acoustical modernity that arises precisely out of the attempt to eliminate the reverberance in concert halls like this, there are concert halls that avoid this problem. But for Gould, they were simply the exception that proved the rule. And in any case, they were irrelevant, because the real problem with the concert hall wasn't aesthetic at all. It was moral. So the concert hall emerged out of a series of massive structural transformations in Western. So you have, for instance, the separation of composition from musicianship, or you have the rise of conservatories, or you have the elevation of instrumental music, for instance, over vocal music, or even the idea, for instance, that music should be experienced in silence by an audience through silent contemplation is something that emerges precisely during this later period, especially the 18th century. Out of those massive transformations, Gould believed, emerged three people and an idea. The three people were this composer, the notion of the composer and the performer and the listener. So during the Renaissance, these three people had been combined for Gould in a single figure. People often composed music, played it themselves for their own personal enjoyment, just for themselves. And during the 18th century, then, specialization had caused that unitary figure to trifurcate into the composer, the listener, and the musician. And all of these three figures were problematic for Gould for reasons that I'll get to in a second. But the problem with the concert hall was that during the 19th century, it had basically arranged those three figures into a hierarchy, and had materially instantiated that hierarchy in the layout of the concert hall itself. So in a picture like this, for instance, performance like this, you end up having the composer as this kind of remote presence, this kind of deity hovering above the scene. You have the performer isolated and elevated on the stage, channeling the intentions of the composer to this kind of passive and rapt audience sitting all around. And the idea of the performance that comes out of this then is the notion of the performance itself as an event, and as an event that is coherent and organic and sacred. So Gould has a problem then, as I mentioned, with all three of the people that emerge from this kind of specialization and from the actions of the concert hall. But he specifically ends up picking out then the performer and the listener, or the audience, for special criticism. The problem with the immorality, really, for Gould of the concert hall lies in what it does to the performer. So he believed that it ended up subjecting the performer to an inhumane experience. Specifically the pressure to end up performing sometimes very long pieces from memory, without any errors, without any second thoughts, without any modifications whatsoever, to an audience of sometimes hundreds of people. And he himself, Edward Said, who's one of Gould's great admirers, actually writes about the concert hall as a space of danger, and about the concert itself as an extreme event. And Gould himself experienced concerts in much this way. He said that he felt demeaned when he was performing, like a vaudevillian. And this is part of a criticism that he ends up mounting against the live arts more generally. He believed that any of the live arts were inhumane because they ended up basically testing people under conditions that they shouldn't need to be tested. But the other problem was not just the conditions under which or to which the performer was subjected, but the corruption that ended up occurring in the person of the performer themselves. So because there was an audience, because the audience responded to the performer, Gould believed that the performer modified their performance in order to please the audience. So sometimes including kind of fancy tricks, but also breeding a kind of conservatism. Because they couldn't make a mistake, because they had to play perfectly, they would end up cultivating a relatively small repertoire of music that they kept in top form all the time. And so this notion, though, of a kind of an outward directed attention, the idea that the performer was focused on the attention of the audience, on the approval of the audience, is something that Gould found, these are his terms, sinful. He felt it was sinful on the part of the performer, but he felt it was also sinful on the part of the audience. That instead of the audience experiencing music, thinking about it kind of internally, inwardly directed, that they were constantly focused, even obsessed, with the virtuoso performer. And that outward lookingness was something that he very deeply objected to. Gould actually hated audiences. He didn't hate them in their individual components, but he hated them en masse. He called them a force for evil. And he basically kind of altered between two descriptions of the audience. On one hand, he described them as often as a mob. So he understood very well, I think, the kind of social reasons why it is that people would attend something like a concert. But he thought that those social reasons had very little to do with the appreciation of music itself. The reason why the audience members ended up attending a concert for Gould was actually the same reason that people had attended the aged Colosseum or the circus or bullfights. It was the lust for blood. He actually called concerts the last blood sport. And he believed that people were drawn to it through the sometimes subconscious desire to see performers fail under unnaturally trying conditions. And so that idea then of the concert experience and the audience as mob really structured a lot of Gould's thinking about technology afterwards, which I'll get to. But the other understanding that Gould had of the audience was much more bloodless and actually invoked the image of machines. He described them as automata. And what he wanted to emphasize there were the kind of rote-like automatic qualities that the audience seemed to display. So the great example of this for Gould was applause. He believed that the reason why most people applauded was because they knew that at a certain point in the performance they were supposed to applaud, and because everybody else was applauding. It was a kind of mechanical, automatic response in that way. And so what linked then for Gould this notion of the mob and this notion of the automata in his mind was the idea that both of them lacked individual judgment, that they were driven by thoughtless actions in the end. And so the audience members especially, kind of fixated with the virtuoso performer, surrounded by other audience members, socially coerced into aping their behavior, they simply couldn't arrive at individual judgments for themselves. So for Gould then, the solution to this were technologies. He basically saw technology as a way then of redeeming these kind of lapsed figures. And Gould had a very self-conscious relationship with technology. So for instance, he loved his car. He would take it on very kind of long trips in northern Ontario driving around. He also conducted most of his friendships, for instance, over the telephone. And the radio formed an enormous part of his life. He grew up with it. He listened to it continuously. He couldn't sleep without it. When he practiced the piano or he was rehearsing a piece, he would usually have two radios actually going at the same time, one on AM for news and one on FM for music, and sometimes would have the television on as well. But he liked what radio did. He basically felt that with things, for instance, like theater, radio theater, that it turned radio theater into something that was kind of pure and abstract. And so around these kind of personal experiences with technology that Gould had, he elaborated this kind of metaphysics of the recording studio, the idea that recording technologies could change kind of relationships of space. They could alter notions of time. They could allow people to act at a distance. And he embedded those kind of sweeping claims about technology within larger kind of techno-historical claims in the 1960s as well. He had read Mumford, for instance, Techniques in Civilization. He was a great admirer of Talard de Chardin, and specifically de Chardin's ideas about the kind of co-development of morality on one hand and technology on the other. But he also, actually, his friend and neighbor for a time in Toronto was actually Marshall McLuhan, whose ideas he actually drew on relatively heavily in certain ways, and I can talk more about that in the discussion. But what I'd like to focus on here is the way in which his ideas about this kind of moral project for technology arose out of local circumstances, out of the reactions to specific machines in the 1960s and to specific media. So, to understand that, we have to understand a bit of the kind of musical geography of Toronto in the 1960s. So, Toronto was an interesting place before our current mayor, Rob Ford, which you may have heard things about in the media. Or it was interesting in different ways, in healthier ways. But the point is that there was this very interesting kind of musical, cultural geography in Toronto in the early 1960s. So there was the kind of blues-inspired jazz of Oscar Peterson, who at one point is actually the chancellor of my own university. Which also means basically that from the late 1950s onward, that Toronto is the home to two of the arguably the greatest pianists of the 20th century. You have Murray Schafer, who ends up leaving Toronto in the 1960s as well to mount his World Soundscape project. Towards the end of the decade, there's the very famous musical chess game that's played between John Cage, the composer on one hand, and Marcel Duchamp, the French avant-garde artist, on the other. And so Gould uses this kind of cultural geography to elaborate his ideas about machines and judgment. So he uses jazz, for instance, and especially improvisation in jazz, as a way of thinking through the question about what real creativity is. He feels, for instance, that the improvisation of jazz is really just a kind of reliance on a set of cliches that under certain circumstances people invoke, and so it gives the appearance of improvisation, but it isn't really. And so real improvisation and creativity lie elsewhere. He drew on, he had a much more complicated relationship actually with the musical avant-garde, but he drew on them in interesting ways as well, especially the French musical avant-garde. So he's suspicious of people or the music of people like John Cage, but he also pokes fun at the avant-garde movement. So Gould loves to control the communication of his ideas, and he develops a number of devices in order to do this. So one thing that he likes to do, for instance, is that he interviews himself often. So he'll publish things like Glenn Gould interviews Glenn Gould about Glenn Gould. But the other thing that he tends to do is to create these fictional characters that he can use then as kind of sounding boards to either parrot views that he wants to criticize or to mount these kind of parody criticisms of his own performances. And one of the most famous of these is Karl-Heinz Klopfweiser. So this is actually Gould dressed up as his fictional character, Karl-Heinz Klopfweiser, who's supposed to be a brilliant German minimalist composer, but is actually a gauze-thin parody of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who's actually a very famous and well-known German avant-garde composer at the time. So Gould's best line, spoken through Klopfweiser, is that he's working currently on a study of the resonance of silence, by which he means, of course, German silence, which is organic, as opposed to French silence, which is merely ornamental. And so he uses then these figures in order to make these kind of sometimes clever, sometimes quite comical comments on either his own performances or the musical scene more generally. But despite poking fun at people like Stockhausen, Gould takes very seriously a lot of the ideas of the musical avant-garde. Stockhausen himself comes out of the musique concrète movement of people like Pierre Schaeffer. The radio resistance movement in France that arises at the end of the Second World War. Pierre Schaeffer's group is interested in a number of different things, but the impetus behind musique concrète is that rather than taking, for instance, a musical score where you take the notes and then you play the music, you produce the sounds that correspond to the notes, that you start with concrete sounds and you abstract their musical value. And so it's this kind of inversion of the usual process of making music. And there are a number of things in the musique concrète movement that Gould is actually very interested in. Pierre Schaeffer describes the experience of musique concrète as acousmatic, by which he means that the music is experienced in a way that you don't actually see what's producing the music itself, so namely in musique concrète through speakers. So you never actually see the performance, you only hear the music, for instance, through speakers. And this is a reference to the acousmatikoi, who are the provisionary disciples, I guess, of Pythagoras, the philosopher who, as initiates, they have to listen to Pythagoras from behind a veil. so that they're not distracted by the vision of the master, that they just have to end up concentrating then on his words. And Gould latches on to these very similar ideas. He talks often about technology as a kind of a screen that allows people to experience music, kind of the structure of music especially more clearly. But the thing that really ends up influencing Gould then is these kind of concrete focus that the musique concrète movement has on machines and on media. So the impulse behind musique concrète is to, as Pierre-Henri, who's one of its members, ends up describing, is to plastify music, to render it plastic like sculpture. And that project really only takes off for Pierre Schaeffer's group after they adopt tape recorders and magnetic tape. So there are many different forms of tape recorder going back to the early 20th century. So often paper, for instance, was initially used, treated in different ways, or wire was used as well. You could actually magnetize the wire. But it's not until magnetic tape comes along that tape recorders really end up taking off. And it's only in the Second World War when the German company AEG actually develops these and makes them kind of commercially available. They're discovered, it turns out, by the Allies, by an American signals officer who's investigating reports of a German death ray outside of Frankfurt, and ends up coming across these two AEG magnetophones, takes them back to the United States, modifies them in the coming years, and then ends up licensing them under the Ampex Corporation, which is the reel-to-reel recorders that almost every recording studio in America uses in the decades afterwards. But it's only when they adopt then these magnetic tape recorders and the specific qualities of the magnetic tape that Pierre Schaeffer's efforts actually take off. And it's those machines then and that media that Gould ends up seeing as the key to this moral project that I ended up mentioning before. So Gould's family was actually one of the first to own a tape recorder in Toronto in the late 1940s. And Gould used it in order to practice and to conduct kind of sonic experiments. So he would take the microphone of the tape recorder and tape it to the sounding board of his piano in different orientations to emphasize the bass or the treble, or to change, for instance, the balance of high and low notes. And throughout his life, he maintains this kind of interest in experimentation. So he has a room, a suite really, at a hotel that used to be just outside of Toronto until recently, called the Inn on the Park. And this is actually that room. You can see a number of the tape recorders and a mixing board, basically, and the television, which was always on, where he conducts these kind of sonic experiments even towards at the end of his life. But he saw then this question about how it is that you deploy tape recorders, how you record, where you place microphones. He saw these as interpretive acts, as part of the act of interpretation of the performer. And as such, he saw them as analytical judgments about how to best communicate, for instance, the structure of a piece. And the thing is that those kinds of judgments weren't in the 1960s for Gould any more limited to these kind of professional style recorders. They were starting to make their entrance, for instance, into homes as well. So this is the TG60, the Braun tape recorder, released around the time that Gould leaves the concert hall in 1964. It's designed actually by Dieter Rams, who many of you may know is a very famous industrial designer. You may actually recognize portions of it because it turns out that the Apple iPhone, the old Podcasts app, actually borrowed very heavily, stole, you might say, certain aspects of its interface actually from the TG60 itself. But Gould saw then these knobs as the key to these kind of interpretive act on the part of the listener as well. Things like bass, for instance, and treble and balance, which seemed like innocuous knobs, seemed like kind of simple kind of technical choices that people were making, were for Gould technical choices that were simultaneously analytical decisions. He said that these kinds of decisions, for instance, about bass, about treble, about balance, were decisions that at any other time in history, in the history of music, would have been considered either conductorial or interpretive decisions. That when you decided, for instance, the balance of a piece, you were either elevating, for instance, the strings or elevating the percussion. These are decisions that a conductor would make. When you end up playing, for instance, with treble or bass, you were making the kinds of decisions that Gould himself would make about choice of piano for playing, for instance, different composers. So he saw then in these kind of minute technical decisions, these larger kind of the capacity at least for these larger kind of analytical decisions on the part of the listener. But he also saw these machines simply as the thin end of the wedge. Behind them, standing behind them, waiting to make their entrance into the living room as well, and to completely transform then the experience of listening to music and the capacity for judgment in it, were the machines actually of the electronic laboratory and the electronic music studio. So Gould actually read the technical reports of at least one of these laboratories. There's an electronic music studio created in Toronto as part of the University of Toronto in 1959. It's one of two music studios on the continent at that point. The first one is actually a collaboration between Columbia and Princeton in New York City. But the Toronto studio ends up playing a very important role in the history of electronic music, because it turns out that Robert Moog and Herbert Deutsch, the inventors of the Moog synthesizer, actually visit the studio in 1964 just after Gould leaves the concert hall to get some crucial feedback on a prototype that they're working on, especially kind of a pass amplifier that they get a suggestion for, and that ends up changing the way that the device ends up functioning for them. But the machines that the studio itself were developing were crucially important and interesting for Gould. And this is one of them. It's called the Creator's tape recorder. And the point about it is that it can play then kind of 6 tapes simultaneously that you can see on the left-hand side there. But the most important part about it is that you can control individually the speed of each one of those tapes. And in controlling the speed, you can actually keep the pitch the same. So, usually if you change the speed at which you play back a tape recording, the pitch drops. But the point about this machine is that it can keep the pitch the same while changing the speed. And so what you can use that to do is to match the tempos of the various pieces to create these kind of counterpoint constructions. So the studio is actually interested in exactly the same kinds of questions that Gould is interested around counterpoint. And in creating these machines that will allow not only musicians to do it, but possibly down the road consumers and listeners to do these things as well. So Gould is very interested then in this question of kind of future machines. And he talks about them again and again and again in his writing, in his public works, in his sound documentaries between about 1964 and 1965, so the year after he leaves the concert hall. But around the spring of 1965, his interest shifts from the kind of knobs and controls of these machines to the loops of tape that you actually see hanging at the top there. And the crucial event seems to be this recording session that he has in the spring of 1965, where he's recording this Bach fugue. Takes a number of takes with his technical team. They seem happy with 2 takes in particular, take 6 and take 8. And so they go away for a few weeks, and then they come back. And in the editing studio, when they come back, they listen to them again, and they think that they sound terrible, actually. Boring is the way that they describe it. So one of them, Gould believes, has too much Teutonic severity. It's kind of too serious. The other one is too skittish and kind of light. But it turns out that a technician realizes that the 2 takes are actually recorded at exactly the same tempo. And so Gould has the idea then that he can splice the beginning and the end of this more severe tape with the central portions of the kind of lighter take. And this proves to be a kind of revelation for him, but it focuses his attention from these machines onto a different act, the act of the splice. And the act of the splice specifically as a kind of a place where judgment can also end up taking place for Gould. So splicing in particular is a very kind of controversial practice in classical music in the 1960s. So within popular music it's actually quite common by this time. The Beatles, for instance, are splicing. Miles Davis is splicing as well. But within classical music it's problematic. And the reason that it's problematic is because of 2 things. One is simply the problem of recording. So one of the ideas that comes out of the concert hall and this notion of a kind of sacred event is the idea of a communion, a kind of physical communion between the audience and the performer. So the idea is, with a pianist, for instance, there's the belief that there's a connection between the kind of finger of the pianist, the key that ends up being struck, the hammer, the vibrating chord, this compressional wave in the air, and the vibrating eardrum, that there's this kind of unbroken chain of physical phenomena that actually connects the performer and the audience. And so the problem then in that context is that recording breaks that connection. It's like writing, for instance, or photography, it's kind of haunted by absence. But there's the idea that if you're going to record, then the recording has to be a faithful document, a sonic document of the event that you're recording. So the problem with splicing then is that it vitiates that kind of integrity of the performance. And because of that, a lot of people consider it actually to be immoral. But Gould himself latches onto this, and he defends splicing tooth and nail. And he sees it really as the core of a new creative process. That rather than doing a number of takes and taking things over and over and over again in a studio until you get it the way that you want, what Gould starts to see is these kind of sections of tape that you see here as the raw material of the real act of performing. that what the performer is going to be doing in Gould's mind actually is assembling this kind of raw material into a larger performance that they actually see as kind of embodying this ideal structure. And that will occupy most of the work actually of the performer, not this question of this kind of taking and retaking takes. And because of this, he defends then the practice of splicing again and again. He says, I see nothing wrong in making a performance out of 200 splices, as long as the desired result is there. I resent the feeling that it is fraudulent to put together an ideal performance mechanically. If the ideal performance can be achieved by the greatest amount of illusion and fakery, more power to those who do it. And he drew then on other media, what he saw as kind of analogous media in some ways, especially avant-garde media, in order to make his point. Gould's favorite movie is a movie called The Woman in the Dunes, which is by a Japanese avant-garde filmmaker named Hiroshi Teshigahara. And he draws on Teshigahara to attack the idea of the documentary ideal in recording. He says, for instance, of film, I wonder how often Hiroshi Teshigahara has been advised that intercuts with cover takes, scenes shot out of sequence, and post-production sound relays should be banned from the vocabulary of film because they fail to observe the limitations of stagecraft. He also pointed to literature. I wonder how often Vladimir Nabokov's publisher has pondered a third and not yet final draft and declared, Volodya, baby, I've told you already, let it all hang out. So you dropped a comma, so you split an infinitive. That's truth, man. So the idea then that the splice is anathema to record music isn't held up by this kind of writing on, for instance, in film. And Gould wanted to extend then the practice of the splice, and specifically its importance for judgment. He developed this kit concept, where he believed that and they would send you 8 versions, 8 interpretations of the same musical piece, and then you as a listener would basically splice them together into your ideal performance. And he saw in this kind of redemption then of the listener, this kind of the creation of a new listener, in fact, an active listener that was kind of participant, and he saw this as the greatest gift of electronic culture then to the modern age. So Gould's ideas then about splicing reached their apogee really not in a musical piece at all, but in a series of sound documentaries that he produces between 1967 and 1977 called the Solitude trilogy. And the Solitude trilogy are these investigations, these kind of thematic investigations of the idea of solitude and its relationship to, especially to creativity. And so the first of these, which is the most famous, is called The Idea of North. And in it, Gould ends up interviewing 5 people about their experience in the Canadian North. And he edits these and splices them in such a way that it seems to create conversations between the 5 different interviewers. So these people are interviewed separately. They're asked a series of set questions that require very long answers. And then Gould splices them in such a way that he actually creates this kind of counterpoint. He calls it contrapuntal radio out of the interviews rather than out of kind of musical lines. And at times, he and his technician, Lorne Tulk, are splicing actually word by word and syllable by syllable. And Gould repeats this then 2 years later for a project called The Latecomers, which is actually about Newfoundland, the easternmost province in Canada, the last one to join Confederation in 1949. And he repeats it basically with 13 lines, so 13 separate interviews, splicing them together. And he and Tulk have to actually create then these new kind of graphical forms to represent what it is that they want to do with the interviews and with the splices. So here you can see he's doing it in stereo now, so you have a right channel and a left channel. And so the lines basically tell you a movement basically from kind of the right channel to the left channel. And then on the vertical axis you have time. So in time, for instance, you'll see, let's say the first one, which is labeled Hurwitz, starts talking, for instance, at 10 seconds, and you could only hear it in the left speaker, and then gradually the sound ends up being transferred to the right speaker at about 25 seconds. And this requires kind of this intense editing. And there's one of these lines then where Gould and Tulk have to edit out all the stammeratives, all the ums and ahs in one of the interviews. And Gould estimates that he actually performs 1,600 splices on this one, for this one interview. So 1,600 kind of passes of martensitic razor steel on magnetized plastic tape in order to get this to turn out the way that he wants. And the very final editing sequence, which you actually see represented here, is especially complex. And it involves having one of the characters, Harris, start off on the right-hand channel and appear as if he walks into the ocean on the left-hand channel. So if you're listening to it, the voice starts off on the right-hand side, and on the left you have the sound of the ocean, this kind of basso continuo of the ocean. And over the course then of this final sequence, the de facto narrator ends up appearing to kind of walk and then disappear into the ocean as the piece ends up finishing. And to get that to work out the way that they wanted, they had to actually string magnetic tape throughout the studio. So you imagine this guy who would like to work at like 3 o'clock in the morning. So there's this amazing scene at like 3 o'clock in the morning of Gould and Tulk in the studio, just surrounded by this kind of skein of magnetic tape draped over music stands, over the backs of chairs. There's one point at which Gould himself is actually holding up a portion of the tape with 2 pencils in his hand as well. And it's there then that I want to end, with that late night vision of Gould and Tulk alone in the studio, surrounded by machines, encircled by a delicate tangle of magnetic tape waiting to be spliced and patched back together, mixed and mastered. Gould saw recording technologies as part of a moral project that envisioned a new kind of person emerging through the capacities and the demands of recording technologies in media. Gould's microphones, his reel-to-reel machines, his hi-fi stereos stand for us alongside the numerous other objects and practices that have shaped specific kinds of historical subjects. Ancient Greek practices of meditation, fasting, reflection, and writing that prepared the philosophical self for enlightenment. Scientific practices of quantification, correlation, or medicalization that went into making up schizophrenics and suicides. And the techniques of self-restraint that formed the scientific self, the knowing subject that in the mid-19th century took shape through the keeping of lab notebooks, the discipline of grid drawing, the production of scientific atlases, and the epistemic self-examination that underwrote the ideal of objectivity. For all Gould's idealism, his approach to music never rested long in the world of essences and ideals and Platonic structures. The mistake that we have made is not to see Gould as an idealist, but to think that he was only an idealist. That his vision of music was only about aesthetics and not about morality. And to imagine that his idealism was set against the material world rather than in union with it. In that vision of Gould, encircled by magnetic tape, possessed by an idea still unrealized, we can also see Gould making his arguments through things. Arguments for the kinds of things we want to say, for the kinds of people we want to be, and for the specific machines and the malleable media that would make them real. Thank you.